Edgar Wesley Hevle. Federal prosecutors could tell you, in detail, what Edgar Wesley Hevle had done inside America's prisons. What they could not tell you, with any confidence, was who he was. His birthplace, his first offense, even the origin of the name other inmates gave him, the Snail, never made it cleanly into the public record. And he was roughly 4 years away from walking out a free man when a single indictment turned the rest of his life into 3 consecutive life terms. For a man who rose so high inside the Aryan Brotherhood, Hevle left behind a remarkably thin paper trail. That blank was not an accident. It was exactly the kind of cover the organization was built to provide its leaders, and by the time Hevle mattered to it, the Brotherhood had grown into something formidable. It was founded in 1964 at San Quentin State Prison in California, in the years when the state's prisons were desegregating and racial factions were hardening behind the walls. Its motto was "Blood in, blood out." Entry historically required an act of violence, and once a man was in, the only recognized exit was death. Over the following decades, it grew into a network estimated at 15,000 to 20,000 members inside and outside prison. And though it was born from a white supremacist ideology, federal investigators and civil rights researchers came to agree that its true engine had become profit, drugs, gambling, and extortion. Despite representing a tiny fraction of the national prison population, the Brotherhood was found responsible for a wildly disproportionate share of prison violence. By the 1990s, Hevle held a place inside the federal leadership of that organization. He was a lieutenant-level figure operating in the shadow of the 2 men at the very top, Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham. The Brotherhood by then governed itself through a 12-man council, and above that council sat a 3-man commission that signed off on violence across the federal system. A man at Hevle's level did not simply act on his own impulses. He carried the will of that leadership from one penitentiary to another, and in an organization spread across dozens of prisons, that role of messenger and enforcer was where much of the real work happened. In January of 1997, held at the Federal Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, he sent word down the line to Brotherhood members at the penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. The instruction was to manufacture weapons and to move against black inmates. It was one link in a longer chain of orders that would, later that year, erupt into a coordinated campaign of violence between the Brotherhood and a rival organization known as the D.C. Blacks. That campaign did not stay contained to a single yard or a single facility. It moved through the federal system as a directive, passed along the same quiet channels Hevle himself used, and it left bodies in more than one prison before the year was out. The government tied Hevle directly to 2 matters. The first was the death of a fellow prisoner named Arva Lee Ray, a man who lost his life inside the federal penitentiary at Lompoc, California, in 1989. The second was his part in the conspiracy behind that 1997 campaign, which ended with 2 men, Frank Joyner and Abdul Salam, losing their lives at Lewisburg on a single day in late August. What set Hevle's situation apart was its timing. According to the record, before federal prosecutors folded him into their racketeering case, Hevle had been on track for release in roughly 4 years. He was a man with an end date, someone who could reasonably have expected to see the outside of a prison wall again. So how does a man that close to freedom end up with no path out at all? The answer took shape in 2002, when the Justice Department unsealed a 140-page indictment charging 40 members and associates of the Brotherhood. It laid out decades of lethal and attempted violence, 32 acts in all. 21 of the defendants were initially eligible for the death penalty, and the lead prosecutor, Gregory Jessner, described the effort as the largest capital case in the history of the American justice system, a deliberate strike aimed at cutting the head off the organization. 19 of the 40 would eventually take plea deals. One died before the case reached a courtroom. Hevla was pulled into the first trial, held in Santa Ana, California, before Judge David Carter. That trial ran for months across 2006. The evidence was unlike almost anything a jury had seen. There were coded messages and cryptograms, including a cipher built on a centuries-old binary code, tape-recorded telephone calls, and one declaration of war that had been written in urine so it would read as invisible ink until the page was treated. Prosecutors had to teach the jury to read a secret language before they could even show what it said. On July 28th of that year, the jury returned its verdicts, and Hevla was convicted alongside Mills, Bingham, and a fourth defendant. Unlike the two men above him, he had not been made eligible for a death sentence, so his path led directly to a term of imprisonment. On November 21, 2006, Judge Carter sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms. His attorney, Bernard Rosen, said afterward that he was stunned by the outcome, arguing that the case against his client had been thin. The court saw it differently, and the man who had expected to be released within a few years received 3 life sentences he could never complete. As of 2026, Edgar Hevla is in his mid-70s and remains in federal custody, with public records placing him at the federal supermax known as ADX Florence in Colorado. That facility opened in 1995 in the high desert of Fremont County, earned the nickname the Alcatraz of the Rockies, and was designed for the roughly 400 prisoners the government most wants to isolate. It became the address of the Brotherhood's top federal leadership, Mills and Bingham among them. The details of the man who moved violence from behind those walls remain, even now, largely unwritten, and that absence is itself part of the story of how the organization protected the people at its center. Hevla belonged to an era when the Brotherhood's orders traveled slowly, hidden in code, folded into letters, whispered from tier to tier. A generation later, another leader would prove the same command could move at the speed of a phone call, from a cell that was never supposed to hold a phone at all. Ronald Yandel. Ronald Yandel was locked inside one of California's most secure prison units, and from there, he ran a drug pipeline that reached the streets of Sacramento. The tool that made it possible was small enough to hide in a fist, a smuggled cell phone. With it, prosecutors say, he moved heroin and methamphetamine, gave orders across the state, and arranged for a rival prisoner's life to be taken. When a judge finally handed down 2 life terms, he told the courtroom that he was still standing and that nothing had changed. Yandel came from Pinole, a small city in Contra Costa County, and he had been moving through the California correctional system for most of his adult life. His history with the Brotherhood ran deep and, by his own telling, ran bloody. He would later claim that he had taken lives for the organization back in the 1980s, and he formally joined its federal branch in the 1990s while serving a sentence for conspiring to manufacture methamphetamine. That drug trade was not incidental to who he was. It was the business the Brotherhood increasingly existed to protect, and Yandel was fluent in it. A later conviction for a death in the 2000s, carrying a term reported as 65 years to life, delivered him to California State Prison, Sacramento, in 2004, and it was there that his standing in the organization began its final climb. Inside that prison, Yandel rose. By 2016, he was describing himself as one of the Brotherhood's California commissioners, sharing that authority with 2 other men, Danny Troxell and David Chance. Then the ground shifted beneath the entire system, and it shifted in a way almost no one expected. For years, California had held its most dangerous prisoners in long-term solitary confinement, a practice that drew legal challenges on the grounds that indefinite isolation amounted to cruel treatment. A landmark settlement resolved those challenges by moving many of those men out of isolation and into less restrictive housing. The intent was humane. One consequence was that some of the very leaders the isolation had been built to contain now found themselves with cellmates, movement, and access they had not had before. Yandel was among them. He was transferred to a unit at Folsom, where he shared a cell with a man named William Sylvester, and from that shared cell, the two of them built a business. Using contraband phones that were never supposed to reach their hands, they directed a trafficking operation in heroin and methamphetamine that pushed narcotics out onto Sacramento's streets. The phones let them speak to buyers, to suppliers, and to the men who worked for them, all from inside a maximum security prison. Those same devices carried Yandel's orders across the state, and in the summer of 2015, one of those orders was to take a life. On the 15th of August, 2015, according to federal and court records, Yandel directed 2 inmates to end the life of another prisoner, Hugo Pinnell. Pinnell was not an anonymous target. He had spent decades inside the California system and was known across it as one of the San Quentin Six, a group tied to a violent 1971 escape attempt that left several people dead. To the Brotherhood, that history made him a high-value name. His death, prosecutors said, was offered up as a reward, with Brotherhood membership promised to the men who carried it out. Roughly a year later, agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration intercepted calls in which Yandel could be heard taking credit for directing the act and for sponsoring the 2 men who acted on it. That interception was no accident. Over a period of months, federal agents had been listening in on the very contraband phones the Brotherhood believed were secure, capturing the leadership speaking in its own words about drugs, debts, and orders. It was a striking reversal. The same devices that had made men like Yandel so dangerous inside the walls, now feeding investigators a record of the enterprise from the inside out. There is a small discrepancy worth noting in the record. Federal and court documents place the event on August 15th, while news coverage of the prison disturbance that followed cites August 12th. What is not in dispute is that Pinnell lost his life inside the prison, and that investigators came to believe the order had come from Yandel's cell. How do you dismantle a criminal enterprise whose leaders are already serving life, already held behind the highest walls the system has? The Justice Department's answer came in 2019 in a federal indictment out of California's Eastern District that named 16 defendants and treated the Brotherhood itself as a racketeering enterprise. Rather than chase each drug deal or each act of violence on its own, the government charged the organization as a single ongoing operation and set out to prove that Yandel helped run it. He stood trial over roughly 9 weeks, a stretch of testimony that walked jurors through intercepted calls, the trafficking network, and the order that had ended Pinnell's life. In April of 2024, the jury convicted him of racketeering conspiracy, of conspiring to take a life, of a death carried out to further the enterprise, and of drug offenses. Prosecutors had withdrawn any pursuit of a death sentence before the case reached that stage. On December 18, 2024, Judge Kimberly Mueller sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms, plus an additional 50 years. Yandel, by the accounts of those present, was unbowed, telling the room that he was still standing and that his life had not changed. He may have felt he had reason to say it. Less than a month earlier, on the 22nd of November, he had allegedly attacked 2 correctional officers with an improvised weapon inside California State Prison, Sacramento, an incident that opened a fresh investigation into an alleged attempt on their lives. As of 2026, Ronald Yandel remains incarcerated, serving the life terms handed down in that case. His cellmate and co-defendant, William Sylvester, received 2 consecutive life terms of his own in December of 2024. The case did not close with them. Another co-defendant, Danny Troxell, was convicted of racketeering conspiracy and of conspiring to take a life, and as the last defendant in the entire prosecution, he was not sentenced to life until November of 2025, more than 6 years after the indictment first came down. Yandel had claimed a seat on the Brotherhood's California Commission, one of 3 men said to approve its violence. He was not the only name at that table to face a federal courtroom. One of the others had been carrying orders and life sentences since long before the smuggled phones ever arrived. John Stinson. John Stinson has been behind bars since 1981, and for much of the time since, he never stopped giving orders. Inside the California prison system, he climbed until he sat near the top of the Aryan Brotherhood's chain of command. One of the deaths tied to that chain was a man targeted not for anything he had done, but for a decision his son had made. Nearly 4 decades into his sentence, federal prosecutors brought him to trial all over again. Stinson's incarceration began with a conviction in Los Angeles County. In 1981, he was found responsible for the death of a Long Beach area heroin dealer named Alfredo Armaito, and he entered the state system while still a young man. That single conviction would have kept him inside for years on its own. What it also did was place him in the exact environment where the Brotherhood recruited, tested, and promoted, and Stinson turned out to be well suited to it. Inside, he found a mentor in Robert Griffin, a leader known by the nickname Blinky. When the Brotherhood formally stood up its California wing at Chino in 1982, Griffin was among the men shaping it, and Stinson aligned himself closely with that leadership. He rose steadily over the following decade, moving from a soldier who carried out the organization's will into a man who said it. By 1994, he was regarded as the predominant leader of the California branch, a position that gave him a voice in decisions reaching across the state's prisons. The nickname followed the arc of that climb. Younger members had once called him Youngster, a name for the up-and-comer he had been. In his 70s, the same organization would know him as Pops, the elder whose words still carried weight decades after most of his peers were gone. The federal case that would define him rested on a series of deaths spread across 15 years. Prosecutors accused Stinson of conspiring in 6 of them between 1982 and 1997, and the pattern behind those 6 said as much about the Brotherhood as any single act. This was an organization whose founding rule was blood in, blood out, an oath that a man entered through violence and left only in death, and much of its internal bloodshed was aimed at enforcing that rule against its own. Among the 6, one stood apart for the cold logic behind it. In 1986, a man named Richard Barnes lost his life. Richard Barnes had no role in the Brotherhood at all. He was targeted because his son, Stephen Barnes, had walked away from the organization and agreed to testify, and the group answered that decision by turning on the family the son had left behind. The message was aimed at everyone watching, a warning that leaving or cooperating could bring harm to the people around you. 3 of the other deaths in the case were Brotherhood members of Stinson's own, men the organization had decided could no longer be trusted, and their fate carried the same warning to anyone thinking of stepping out of line. What kind of authority allows a man locked in a cell to decide from a distance which lives continue and which do not? That question sat at the center of a Los Angeles federal trial in 2007, part of the same nationwide racketeering effort that had already convicted the Brotherhood's federal leadership the year before. This second trial turned to the California machine, and Stinson stood at its center. On January 9th of that year, he was convicted alongside Griffin, his old mentor, of racketeering conspiracy and of violent crimes committed in service of the organization. On September 10, 2007, the court sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. For most defendants, that would have been the end of the legal story, a sentence so total there was nothing left to add. For Stinson, it was only an interruption. More than a decade later, his name surfaced again, this time in the sweeping federal case built out of Fresno that reached across the modern Brotherhood, the same prosecution that had brought down Ronald Yandel. Prosecutors alleged that Stinson still sat on the organization's 3-man commission, still helping to approve acts of violence from within the walls, years and years after his first federal conviction. That claim proved harder to carry into a courtroom than the government might have hoped. Much of the testimony about his role came secondhand, from witnesses describing what they had been told rather than what they had personally seen. And many of those witnesses were themselves admitted criminals testifying in exchange for leniency, the kind of testimony a jury weighs with care. A jury weighing a man's remaining freedom holds that kind of evidence to a high standard. In the end, they convicted him on a single count of racketeering conspiracy in February of 2025, declining to find him responsible for the specific acts of violence the government had tied to the others. On May 19, 2025, he received a term of 20 years, stacked on top of the life sentences he was already serving. 20 additional years mean little to a man already facing 3 lifetimes. The conviction mattered for a different reason. It formally marked him, once again, as a leader of the enterprise the government had spent decades trying to dismantle. As of 2026, John Stinson remains incarcerated, held on overlapping California state and federal life terms with no realistic path to release. A man who entered prison as a young offender in 1981 has now spent well over 4 decades inside, and the record the government assembled suggests his authority within the organization survived nearly every one of those years. That endurance is what made him valuable to the Brotherhood and difficult for the system holding him. Even locked in a maximum security cell, Stinson kept a hand in the organization's decisions, and 2 separate federal juries, 18 years apart, accepted that a man could run a criminal enterprise from a place built to remove him from the world entirely. Stinson's power was built inside the California wing of the Brotherhood, the state machine that ran its own affairs. The organization had a second half, though, a federal arm, and at the head of it sat a man whose reach extended further than any of them, from a cell where he was permitted almost nothing at all. Barry Mills. Barry Mills spent nearly his entire adult life in prison, and from inside it, he became one of the most feared gang leaders in the country. He wore dark glasses, kept to himself, and by his own lawyer's account, passed some of his hours crocheting and embroidering. He also, according to federal prosecutors, ordered a coast-to-coast war against a rival group, an order he sent in a message written in invisible ink. By the end, 4 deaths were tied to him, and he was given 4 consecutive life terms. Mills was born in Windsor, California, in 1948. His first taste of incarceration came in 1967, a year spent in county lockup, and he entered the California state prison system after an armed robbery at a store in Sonoma County in 1969. From that point forward, he never lived as a free man again. Nearly everything the public came to know about Barry Mills, he became on the inside. The prison, not the outside world, was where his adult life was spent, and it was where his power was built from nothing into something the federal government would eventually treat as a national threat. It was inside San Quentin that he joined the Brotherhood, and it was inside the federal system that he became its paramount figure, one of the 3 men on the commission that governed the organization's federal faction alongside Tyler Bingham and John Greshner. Bald, broad, and mustachioed, he wore dark glasses over an eye that had been injured in a prison brawl, and the men around him called him the Baron. There was a second, stranger detail that his own defense would later lean on. In his cell, this man who sat atop a violent enterprise spent quiet hours crocheting and embroidering, and when his life was on the line, his lawyers made sure the jury heard about it. It was an attempt to place a human being, with small, ordinary habits, in front of people being asked to decide whether he should die. The government attributed a long trail of violence to Mills. The earliest documented instance reached back to May of 1979, when a fellow prisoner named John Sherman Marsloff lost his life inside the federal penitentiary in Atlanta over an unpaid gambling debt. A decade later, in 1989, Mills was tied to the death of Arva Lee Ray at Lompoc, the same death that would later help sink Edgar Hevely, and then there was the war. In 1997, Mills and Bingham gave the order for a nationwide campaign against the D.C. blacks. What made the order remarkable was how it traveled. Rather than risk a phone line or a letter that guards could read, the leadership committed the declaration to a page in urine, a homemade invisible ink that revealed itself only under the right conditions. From two men in isolation, the instructions spread outward through the Brotherhood's hidden channels, the same kind of channels Edgar Hevely was working at the very same time, until it arrived in prisons far from where it was written. The campaign that followed reached the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, where two men, Frank Joyner and Abdul Salam, lost their lives on the same August day. Joyner and Salam were ordinary prisoners who happened to be within reach when a distant order came due. Investigators later traced those deaths back to the written command, showing how far the Brotherhood's leadership could reach from a single locked cell. How does a single message, written in a prison cell in a substance meant to disappear, set violence in motion in penitentiaries hundreds of miles away? That reach was exactly what the Justice Department set out to break. When the racketeering case went to trial in Santa Ana in 2006, Mills was its lead defendant, the name the entire prosecution had been built to reach. The government framed the case as a decapitation strike against the Brotherhood's leadership, and the evidence against Mills included the coded communications and the invisible ink declaration that had come to symbolize how the organization operated. On July 28, 2006, the jury convicted him of racketeering, conspiracy, and the deaths at the heart of the case. The penalty phase did not go the way prosecutors intended. The jury deadlocked on whether Mills should face a death sentence, reportedly leaning toward it but unable to reach the unanimity the law required, and the split produced a mistrial on that single question. There is an irony in it. The crocheting, the coded messages, the whole portrait of a man who was at once ordinary in his habits and capable of directing great violence may have been part of what kept a handful of jurors from voting to end his life. With the death penalty off the table, the outcome settled into life. In November of 2006, Barry Mills was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, and he was sent to ADX Florence, the supermax where the country holds the prisoners it most wants isolated. He would spend his final years there, cut off from the network he had once commanded across the entire federal system. The man who had moved armies of followers with a few lines of hidden writing now lived in a concrete room, his contact with the outside world reduced to almost nothing. On July 8, 2018, one day after his 70th birthday, Barry Mills was found dead in his cell. The Fremont County coroner determined that he had died of natural causes, with no sign of foul play. As of 2026, he is one of 2 men in this account who did not live to see the newest chapter of the organization he helped run. The courts never did manage to sentence him to death. He died of age and illness, still serving 4 life terms, decades after the last free day of his life. Mills reached the top of the Brotherhood after decades of climbing, a man the organization had shaped over a lifetime inside. Not everyone in its ranks arrived that way. Some men were already carrying a life sentence when they first heard the name of the gang, brought to prison by something they had done long before, in a single terrible night that had nothing to do with any organization at all. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Francis Clement. Francis Clement had already spent most of his life behind bars when federal prosecutors accused him of ordering deaths on the streets of Los Angeles from inside a prison cell. What put him there in the first place was something he did as a teenager, on the very day he turned 18. And decades later, when a jury finally weighed the full scope of what he was accused of directing, it held him responsible for 5 separate deaths. Clement was a native of Springfield, Oregon, and by every account, his adult life began the way it would largely continue, inside a prison. He entered the California state system in 1985, convicted of unlawfully taking a life, at the lesser of the 2 degrees the law recognized, for a death that occurred during a road trip he had planned as a celebration. The trip was meant to carry him and a companion toward Las Vegas to mark his 18th birthday. It ended instead in a confrontation that turned lethal, and a young man with his whole life ahead of him was sent into the state prison system with a conviction that would define everything that came after. Inside, the record grew darker. In the years that followed, Clement built a reputation as one of the more feared figures in the California prisons, a man other inmates did not cross. Prison authorities later alleged that he formally aligned himself with the Aryan Brotherhood in the mid-1990s. Clement himself never accepted that label. At parole hearings over the years, he insisted flatly that he belonged to no gang and never intended to, a denial he would carry all the way into a federal courtroom decades later. Whatever he called himself, the government came to see him as something specific, a man with rank inside the organization, and rank inside the Brotherhood meant a share of its business. Prosecutors said Clement drew a cut from the drug sales and fraud schemes the gang ran through the California system, where methamphetamine and other narcotics were smuggled into facilities across the state and sold to inmates. The tool that turned an imprisoned man into an active commander was, once again, the contraband cell phone. With one in hand, a man locked in a cell could reach across prison walls and out onto the street, and prosecutors said that is exactly what Clement did. Between roughly 2015 and 2023, according to the federal case, the Brotherhood operated as a racketeering enterprise, and Clement sat close enough to its center to order lives ended. In October of 2020, prosecutors said he and another leader named Kenneth Johnson ordered the death of a man named Alan Roshansky, a convicted pimp who had failed to cut the 2 of them in on a fraud scheme. When the order was carried out in the Los Angeles County community of Lomita, a second man, Ruslan Magomedgadjiev, lost his life alongside Roshansky, having come along as backup. Roughly a year and a half later, in February of 2022, Clement ordered another death, that of a man named Michael Brizendine in Lancaster. The following month, in March of 2022, 2 more men, James Yeagle and Ronnie Ennis, lost their lives in Pomona. In each instance, the government said the reason was the same. The victims were believed to have broken the Brotherhood's rules or owed the organization money. What allows a man who has spent his entire adult life in a cell to reach so far beyond it, to decide the fate of people walking free on the other side of the wall? The answer, the Justice Department decided, was to treat the whole apparatus as a single criminal enterprise and prosecute it as one. Clement became a defendant in the sweeping Fresno case that reached across the modern Brotherhood, the same prosecution that named John Stinson and dozens of others. His trial unfolded over roughly a month, and prosecutors built their account of the deaths on the testimony of a long line of cooperating witnesses, admitted criminals themselves who described the orders they said had come down from men like Clement. In February of 2025, the jury returned its verdict. It found Clement guilty of racketeering conspiracy and of 5 separate counts of a death carried out in aid of racketeering, one for each of the 5 men. Clement did not stand alone. Kenneth Johnson, another reputed leader, was convicted alongside him and found responsible for 2 of the deaths, while John Stinson, already featured in this account, was convicted on a single racketeering count. Prosecutors described the 3 of them as the elite of the organization, men who ruled the white population of the California prisons through fear and the power to decide who lived. It was a striking claim to make about defendants who were already serving life terms and had been behind bars for years, and it captured the core of the government's theory that imprisonment had never actually stopped them. On May 19, 2025, a federal judge sentenced Francis Clement to life in prison. Because the federal system has no parole, the sentence carried a finality his earlier state terms never quite had. In a sentencing memorandum, prosecutors described him as a man who had shown a complete disregard for human life in directing the deaths of his victims, and they argued that a federal penitentiary was precisely where such a man belonged. His lawyers had asked for his sentencing to be delayed, and prosecutors accused him and his co-defendants of simply trying to postpone an inevitable transfer into federal custody. Around the same time, the Bureau of Prisons had already begun taking custody of other members convicted in the same prosecution, moving them into high-security federal penitentiaries, and Clement was understood to be bound for the same destination. The point of the exercise was straightforward. If a man could run an operation from a California cell, the government wanted him somewhere far more restrictive. As of 2026, Francis Clement remains incarcerated, now serving a federal life term stacked atop the state sentence he had carried since the 1980s. He had entered prison as a teenager for a life taken on a single night. Decades later, he stood convicted of ordering 5 more deaths, directed from inside the very system that was supposed to have contained him. Clement ran his reach out through a phone and a network of men willing to act on his word. But there was another member of the Brotherhood whose deadliest instrument was not a person at all. It had 4 legs, and it was raised from inside a prison cell to become a weapon. Paul Schneider. Paul Schneider was serving a life sentence in one of California's most isolated prison units when a life was taken hundreds of miles away in the hallway of a San Francisco apartment building. He never touched the victim. What reached her was something he had helped raise and arm from inside his cell, an animal bred for the single purpose of doing harm. And in the days after her passing, the strangeness of the case only deepened when the 2 people caring for that animal did something almost no one could explain. Paul John Schneider was, by the assessment of prison authorities, among the most dangerous men in the California system, a reputation captured in the nickname other inmates gave him, corn-fed, a way of saying he was the worst of the worst. He stood well over 6 feet and carried a long criminal history. He had robbed a string of armored cars before he was caught and sentenced, and once inside, his violence did not stop. After he harmed a guard at Folsom, the state moved him to Pelican Bay, the maximum security facility built to hold the prisoners it could control nowhere else. By the time his name reached the public, He was serving 3 life sentences, and he had risen to a position of real standing within the Aryan Brotherhood. One episode captured the kind of man the system was dealing with. Displeased with how a lawyer was representing a fellow Brotherhood member, Schneider smuggled a homemade blade into a Sacramento courthouse and turned it on the attorney, an act that added a conviction for attempting to take a life to his record. This was a man who had reached out from custody to harm an officer of the court in a courthouse itself. So when prison officials learned what he was quietly running from inside Pelican Bay, they understood at once how serious it could be. Along with his cellmate, a fellow lifer named Dale Breches, Schneider had gone into the dog business. The idea, by later accounts, took shape after Schneider read a magazine article about the breed. And from inside a sealed housing unit, the 2 men set out to arrange the breeding and sale of Presa Canarios, a large and powerful mastiff, operating through a venture that even carried its own name evoking dogs of war. To run an enterprise like that, they needed people on the outside, and they found them in a married pair of attorneys, Robert Noel and Marjorie Knoller, who had been doing legal work at the prison. The lawyers agreed to take in and raise several of the animals. According to prison and police officials, the operation involved roughly 8 of the dogs, and investigators suspected they were being bred as weapons, guardians for illicit operations or worse, though the people involved denied it. At one point, according to the record, Schneider complained that the animals were being allowed to go soft, and the 2 attorneys moved to take direct control of a pair of them. What is beyond dispute is that those 2 dogs, a male and a female, ended up living in a San Francisco apartment building, in a unit across the hall from a woman named Diane Whipple. Diane Whipple was a 33-year-old college lacrosse coach, a former standout athlete admired by the students she trained. On the 26th of January, 2001, she was returning to her apartment when the 2 dogs attacked her in the hallway. She did not survive. Her passing turned a quiet residential building into the center of a national news story, and it drew a straight line from a sealed cell in a remote prison to a doorway in a San Francisco high-rise. How does a man locked in a maximum security cell end up responsible, even at a distance, for a life taken in a building he had never set foot in? Because Schneider was already serving life, the criminal trial that followed did not center on him. It centered on the 2 people who had kept the dogs, Robert Noel and Marjorie Knoller. The case became a landmark in California law. Noel, who was not present when the attack happened, was convicted of the lesser charge, of unlawfully causing a death through his own negligence. Knoller, who was there, faced a far more serious accusation, one that in California does not require any intent to cause a death, but rests instead on a conscious disregard for a known and extreme danger to human life. A jury found her responsible on that greater charge, an unusual outcome for a death caused by animals rather than a human hand. The trial judge, uneasy with the verdict, set that finding aside, but higher courts ultimately restored it, and the case went on to shape how the state treats deaths caused by that kind of extreme disregard to this day. Then came the detail that no one saw coming. 3 days after Diane Whipple lost her life, Noel and Knoller, both middle-aged, legally adopted Schneider, a man then in his late 30s, as their son. The narrow gap in their ages made the arrangement stranger still, and it drew national attention to a bond between a Jewish attorney and a member of a white supremacist gang that few could rationally account for. When investigators searched Schneider's prison cell, they found intimate photographs of Knoller among his belongings. The relationship between the imprisoned Brotherhood figure and his 2 attorneys had blurred into something the courts and the public struggled to describe, and it exposed just how far the reach of a man in a sealed unit could extend into the lives of people on the outside. For his part, Schneider did not adopt the defiance his adoptive parents showed. Where the two attorneys at times seemed to shift blame toward the woman who had lost her life, Schneider offered an apology, acknowledging that what had happened was wrong even as he insisted the animal had not understood what it was doing. He also pursued the state from inside his cell in the way an aggrieved inmate could, filing a large financial claim against the California Department of Corrections over the handling of his case. It was a final, telling image of the man, still maneuvering, still reaching outward, from within the most secure housing the state had. As of 2026, Paul Schneider remains incarcerated in the California prison system, still serving the life terms he was already carrying when Diane Whipple lost her life. He was never charged in her death, but the case permanently attached his name to it, and it stands as one of the clearest illustrations of a central truth about the Brotherhood, that a locked cell does not sever a dangerous man's ability to set harm in motion far beyond it. Schneider improvised his weapon from an animal. Others in the Brotherhood relied on smuggled phones or coded notes. But the systems that made all of it work, the money, the messages, the methods, did not appear on their own. Someone built them, and that someone eventually turned against the very machine he had helped design. John Greshner. For roughly a quarter of a century, John Greshner was one of the three men at the very top of the federal Aryan Brotherhood, a commissioner whose vote could decide whether another man lived or died. He was, by his own account, the organization's engineer, the one who built the banking system, wrote the secret codes, and taught the gang how to make weapons in a cell. Then, in 1999, he did the one thing the Brotherhood's code was designed to make impossible. He walked away, and he began telling the world how the whole machine worked. Greshner's life inside began early. He was first incarcerated as a teenager for a string of robberies and shootings, and by the time he formally joined the Brotherhood in 1977, he was a hardened career criminal in his mid-20s, serving federal time for armed robbery and aggravated assault. He was also facing an accusation that he had tried to take the life of a police officer during a gun battle after escaping a state prison in Minnesota. In other words, the man who would become the Brotherhood's chief organizer arrived already fluent in the only currency the gang truly respected, a long and violent record. It was at a federal transfer facility in Indiana, a way station convicts had their own grim nickname for, that Greshner first crossed paths with Barry Mills, the future Baron, both men waiting to be moved deeper into the federal system. The two would spend years intertwined, first as allies who built the federal organization together, and finally as adversaries when Greshner decided the whole thing had lost its way. Greshner rose quickly. In 1983, he was convicted in the death of a fellow inmate, a man known inside as Rhino, at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, a conviction that brought him a double life sentence. But it was his mind, more than his hands, that made him valuable. Alongside Mills and a third leader, Tyler Bingham, Greshner sat on the federal commission that governed the Brotherhood's affairs across the national prison system. And by his own later admission, he was the one who built the infrastructure that turned a violent prison clique into a durable criminal enterprise. The details he would eventually describe were remarkable. He said he had instituted a banking and collection system for the gang, complete with a standing levy, reported as 1/5 of the profits, on any Brotherhood venture operating on the streets, money that was then laundered and moved through trusted hands. That system mattered more than any single act of violence, because it gave the organization something most prison gangs never achieve: a treasury and a way to move it. He had also developed complex written codes so that members could communicate between prisons and with associates in the free world without guards understanding a word, and he helped decide who was allowed into the organization in the first place, vetting prospective members and voting on the leadership decisions that included which men would be marked for death. On top of all that, he served as the organization's resident expert in improvised weapons, including poisons and explosives he devised inside prison cells. In every meaningful sense, Greshner had designed the tools that let leaders keep operating even after the system tried to shut them away. And during 2 decades of rapid growth, he helped turn a violent prison clique into what investigators would come to call the largest and deadliest prison-based gang in the country. Just how tightly those men could be sealed off, and how stubbornly they kept working anyway, is captured by one detail from the late 1990s. Greshner, Mills, and Bingham were by then held in isolation cells at ADX Florence, the federal supermax built specifically to cut such men off from one another and from the outside. The government had moved them there to silence them. It did not entirely work. According to Greshner, the commissioners would drain the water from the metal toilets in their cells and speak to one another through the empty pipes, holding meetings from separate sealed rooms in the most restrictive prison in the country. What finally breaks a man's loyalty to an organization he spent half his life building? For Greshner, it was a matter of principle turned rotten. He grew disgusted, he later said, when Mills began ordering the deaths of Brotherhood members over what Greshner regarded as personal grievances rather than the organization's real business. In 1999, he left the Brotherhood, testifying in a drug case against another senior member. By the gang's own rules, walking out that way put him, in the organization's own language, in the hat, a phrase meaning he was now marked for death, that any member who could reach him was expected to act. It was the same logic the motto had always carried, that the only sanctioned way out of the Brotherhood was to die. He did it anyway, and he survived. In the years that followed, Greshner became one of the most important windows the public ever had into the Brotherhood, sitting for national television documentaries and long interviews with researchers in which he laid out the banking, the codes, the bloodshed, and the philosophy behind them. He described a mindset in which every death was meant to send a message, a way of making sure everyone in the system understood what the organization was willing to do. For investigators who had spent decades trying to understand the gang from a distance, a former commissioner willing to explain how it truly worked was something close to invaluable. As of 2026, John Greshner remains incarcerated, still serving the double life sentence handed down for the death at Leavenworth, and still speaking publicly about the organization he helped run, most recently in interviews recorded well into this decade. He is a rare figure in this account, a man who sat at the very top of the machine, understood every gear of it, and then chose to spend his remaining years explaining it to the people it was built to defeat. Greshner helped design a system meant to survive isolation. The government's answer to men like him was to make isolation more total than anything that had come before, and no prisoner in the country would test the outer limit of that isolation longer or become more synonymous with it than the final man in this account, Thomas Silverstein. Thomas Silverstein spent roughly 36 years in near-complete isolation, longer than any other prisoner in the federal system, held so far apart from other people that his official status was recorded as no human contact. The federal government did not simply lock him away. It designed a special cell and eventually helped inspire an entire class of prison in direct response to what he had done. And what he had done began inside the one place that was supposed to make violence impossible. Silverstein entered the federal system in 1978, sentenced for an armed robbery. The Bureau of Prisons came to regard him as a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, though he himself never accepted the label. Whatever his affiliation, his path through the system grew steadily more violent. While held at Leavenworth, he was accused of a fellow inmate's death, a conviction that was later overturned when it emerged that informants had lied on the stand. He was moved to the federal penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, then the most secure prison in the country, a place built to hold the men no other facility could manage. Inside Marion, 2 more deaths were tied to him, both connected to a rival organization, and each brought another life sentence. By the early 1980s, Marion had become a place where the most dangerous prisoners in America, many of them already serving life with nothing left to lose, took lives almost at will. Silverstein was at the center of that world, and on October 22, 1983, he reached the moment that would define the rest of his life. Using a homemade key, he slipped free of his handcuffs while being escorted through the unit and took the life of a corrections officer named Merle Klutz, a 51-year-old veteran of the prison. Silverstein claimed the officer had been harassing him and destroying his artwork. Hours later, in a grim echo, another Brotherhood inmate named Clayton Fountain slipped his own restraints with a nearly identical trick and took the life of a second officer. 2 officers lost in a matter of hours inside the prison built to contain the worst the system had, sent a shock through the entire federal government. There was no federal death penalty available at the time, which meant the prison had no ultimate sanction left to impose on a man already serving multiple life terms. Prisoners like Silverstein, in the government's own reading, understood that perfectly. They were already serving the harshest terms the law allowed, in the most secure setting it had, and they knew there was little more the system could take from them. So the Bureau of Prisons reached for a different answer. The director ordered Marion sealed into an indefinite lockdown that would last some 23 years, and the reasoning behind that decision, that certain prisoners had to be permanently separated from everyone, helped drive the creation of the modern federal supermax, ADX Florence, which opened in 1994. In a real sense, the most isolating prison in the country exists in part because of Thomas Silverstein. For Silverstein himself, the officer's death began a stretch of confinement, almost without parallel. He was placed under an order of no human contact and moved first to a specially built cell in the basement of the penitentiary in Atlanta. A windowless room where a light burned overhead at all hours, and cameras watched him without pause. In the early stretch there, his contact with the outside amounted to little more than a Bible, though over time he was permitted art supplies and a radio. He was later held for years in a custom unit at Leavenworth that other prisoners referred to by his own name, with a small sealed recreation yard walled off from the world, and in 2005 he was transferred to ADX Florence, where he lived in a concrete room roughly the size of a bed, his contact with the world reduced to almost nothing. He would later describe the experience in stark terms, saying it was closer to being buried alive than to serving a sentence. Can a punishment be just and still amount to something the law was never meant to allow? That question sat at the heart of the legal fight that consumed Silverstein's final decades. Over the years, he changed by many accounts. He became a serious, self-taught artist whose work drew genuine attention beyond the prison, practiced yoga, studied Buddhism, took anger management courses, and in 2011, he apologized to the family of the officer whose life he had taken. He built up a quarter-century of good behavior and positive evaluations from the prison's own psychiatrists. On the strength of that, he filed suit challenging his endless isolation as unconstitutional, arguing that whatever he had done, no one was meant to be held apart from humanity for the rest of his natural life. The courts were not persuaded. A federal judge ruled that his confinement was not atypically extreme, and the federal appeals court held that even a stretch of roughly 3 decades in solitary did not, on these facts, amount to cruel and unusual punishment. The isolation, the courts decided, would stand, and it did, until the end. On May 11, 2019, Thomas Silverstein died in a Colorado hospital from complications following heart surgery at the age of 67. He had spent roughly 36 years in isolation, believed to be the longest such stretch in the history of the federal prison system. In the years since, his name has remained a fixture in the national argument over long-term solitary confinement, cited by advocates who point to his decades in a concrete box as evidence of a practice that had drifted past punishment into something else, and by prison officials who counter that some men leave the system no other safe option. He had also, by the end, become the subject of books and documentaries, remembered as much for the extremity of his confinement as for the acts that caused it. As of 2026, he is the second of the 2 men in this account who did not live to see the present, his name permanently bound to the very prison conditions his own actions helped bring into being. 8 men, held in 8 of the most secure cells the country could build, and one truth running through every case: a locked door was never the end of their reach. The prisons that held them only grew harder over the decades, and still the orders found their way out, carried by phones and coded notes, by trusted hands, and once, by an animal. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.